All
So I
right.
think
Good.
one good conversation might be, how did your book launch go?
Oh yeah, yeah. Thanks for asking. It went really well. There were a couple of unexpected things. Like I didn't expect the Kindle edition to do so well. Like it was on the number one new release list for education assessment for like days. It's off now, so we're recording March 24th at 6:05 p.m. Um, but it was on there for like for a I don't know, maybe 3 days or something, like ahead of the launch. So I think there just must have been a lot of either Kindle pre-orders or maybe a lot of people were looking at that particular one. I don't know how like that whole thing works, but I just thought that that was interesting. But
That's
people are
very
receiving them now,
interesting.
yeah, and posting pictures and stuff, which just makes me really happy.
I got mine a week and a half ago, probably.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we could just start casual conversation. What was what's your take on the origin story of the fireside chat format for us?
Well, I think you and I bounced around the idea of, well, actually, it originated with one of our training series
Yeah.
where I heard you say data is a reflection of our own work. And it just drew me in to think, gosh, Ryan knows a lot of these really important and yet very, very simple ways to think about data. And so from that, I think we kind of felt like there would be a good opportunity to create a mini library so for people who are coaches or doing training, if they need a little soundbite for a particular aspect of data, based decision making, or you talk about the ethical use of data, you talk about scripts for adults to use. I shouldn't say just adults, because I'm doing a lot of work with youth and data. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot to be shared, and some feedback after the webinar you did for us at Old Dominion University was really phenomenal. People appreciated how the material was distilled into usable kind of chunks, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, when we first started bouncing the idea back and forth, like we were both equally excited about it, which kind of leads to the question, what do you think it is about bite-sized format? Like what I mean by that is little clips of conversation about data. What do you think it is about that format that was attractive to both of us? Is there something about data that just lends itself to that?
Gosh, I think the expectation in the industry, in the education industry, is that we anchor as much as we can on data.
Yeah.
And, over time, No Child Left Behind, I think, might have kicked that off. Over time, there have been opportunities to become more fluent with it. But if I think about a classroom teacher and I think about asking him or her to, make some decisions in the classroom based on data beyond academic data, I've heard many teachers just not know where to go with that request, or you know what I mean? And I think having small opportunities to learn, in this case about data use, has much more utility than a 45-minute webinar.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it can be, I've been thinking a lot about this idea that like people like you and me who, for whatever reason, are rewarded by just the data use on its own, like that can be enough. It can be easy for us, definitely for me, I won't speak for you, but in my experience, like I can make the assumption that, because I get excited by just the opportunity to look at data, that it must be true that others would also. And what ends up happening is I then completely leave out this necessary part of the work, which is, like it has to be made relevant. It has to be made a relevant tool to the person that you're sharing it with. If they are one of, like, I think probably most people who are just like, data on its own is not that's not necessarily fun. I feel like it's kind of, I don't know, tell me if you feel this way. It's a little bit of like the curse of of like enjoying data, like until you realize that lesson, you're just, it's a little, you're just, I'm just like, oh, this isn't fun for you.
Yeah, I'm with you. I agree with you there.
It's almost like you just have to, there's a whole, but I will say though, the bright side of it is like once I learned that lesson, then the job was less like do really good data analysis. That's always going to be a part of it. But the job became a lot more like find the connection for the person who I'm talking with, because it's there. So like find a way to make this tool compelling because they do care about some other outcome. In schools, that's creating a great experience for kids. But any other industry, there's some other outcome. And the data is like one of many tools that they have that they'll use because they'll use any tool to get that outcome.
Right.
Which is, just hard. That was kind of a hard lesson learned.
And I also think if I'm thinking about classroom teachers right now, and just to say, gather some data on this particular outcome, right? There are components or there's steps to doing that. Like, how do you go about gathering that data? What piece of data will give me the information that I need? If it's reading level, of course, that's obvious, but there are other, points that folks might need some support thinking about. What data point do I need to gather? How do I gather it? When? Just the very how to. I think can sometimes trip people up and avoid the task. But I think like both the newsletter and your talks and our coaching through PBIS, I think we try really hard to make sure educators have that level of knowledge. It's not just go in there and use data to analyze a big question.
Totally.
You got to start somewhere.
Right? Even if I really like that. Even if it's a routine that's imperfect, it's better than no routine, I find, because then it's like you kind of get paralyzed by the task. I think it's sort of what you're pointing to is you get paralyzed by the task, right? Like, because the ask is like, in some cases it's like literally be more data driven, which means like nothing, right? Until you start thinking about, okay, what do I actually get paid to do? Like that's a like question number one. If I did that thing really, really well, what decisions will I have to have made really well? So for example, like I was a school psychologist. So, you can answer the question, what do I get paid to do in all kinds of different ways as a school psychologist, but to pick a simple one, get my student evaluations done on time, right? Fairly mundane, but part of the job. If I did that really well, then what decisions will I have had to have made? Well, I had to organize my schedule a certain way. I had to be able to prioritize more urgent cases over others. I would have had to have sequenced the order of evaluations. I would have had to group students together when that's appropriate, right? All these key decisions. And then I really think at that point you have the data questions but that's like it takes a couple of steps, right? Because then the questions are like, okay, so then what are the sources of data, as imperfect as they are, that I can use to make those decisions, right? And so following with that example, it could be, well, I got a spreadsheet. In one column I have the student's name, and in the second column I have the dates that they're due, and then I sort it, and that's a data set. That's very practical to a school psychologist, maybe not practical to other people, but if they follow those steps, they will arrive at a source of data that could be practical to them, right? And that's where I think it's. But to your point, that's not always taught. Maybe never. I'm not sure.
I know. Well, and I think practical. I think that's an important word in this conversation. Is, how do we make it practical, usable? I think of another example of. I attended and I'm not a school counselor, so I may not have the professional organization correct, but it's ASCA, I think. It's the American Association of School Counselors. Anyway.
Okay, yeah.
number of years ago, and there
Yeah.
was a lot of conversation about making their profession more data driven.
Interesting.
And this was their national conference. And, I started thinking about how that's a great ask.
Yeah.
How are you going to break that down to
Right.
be helpful?
Yeah.
And so I know when we train, particularly tier 2 in PBIS, one of the things, check in, check out, actually,
Yeah.
we talk about how you can take an existing data collection tool like a daily progress report
Hmm.
and so let's say counselors are doing a small group around anger management. So if we've got that daily progress report, we might add the skill that the counselor is teaching onto that student's
Hmm.
daily progress report. So it's an existing mechanism. And now once a day or 5 times a day, whatever the intervals are that are set up, there's data being collected and it's just organic. It's already part of an existing mechanism. And what that allows that counselor to do is to review the kind of the effectiveness of his or her skills group.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
I kind of just always think about how do we help make that doable without adding extra.
Totally. But say more about check in, check out. Like, I don't think I know what that means.
Check in, check out is a tier 2 practice,
Uh-huh.
and it is tier 2 in PBIS means it's something we do for some students, but it
Yes.
looks the same for those enrolled.
Yes.
Check in, check out is just literally a structured tier 2 intervention whereby students check in the morning, really quick check in.
Yeah.
They have a daily progress report that aligns with their school-wide expectations. So be respectful, be responsible, be safe. They report to every teacher at the end of the class period, and there's a dialogue about how they did 210, whatever the
Mhm.
scoring is.
Mhm.
And at the end of the day, they check back out with it's not a mentor,
Yeah.
but the idea, mentor is a heavy lift. This is just a quick conversation.
Sure.
And what happens is you're collecting data
Yeah.
that's essentially anchored back to what the school-wide expectations are. And some of the what that creates, what check and check out offers, is additional practice for students because they're enrolled in this because they've said, hey, I need a little bit more.
Yeah.
I need a little more instruction around my social, emotional, behavioral competencies. So they get interactions with teachers at given numbers of time, both hopefully instructional, but also that's an opportunity for feedback.
Mhm.
And so it's a great structure. And once, students are in check and check out, if it becomes apparent through data that they need additional supports, we kind of talk about, don't take them out of it.
Yeah.
We're going to change it. We're going to adapt it so that our data that we're collecting for this young person is apples and apples.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's such a clean way to collect data on a particular student. And of course you can look at it from obviously a fidelity perspective too, but it's just I think it's a clean way not longitudinally, but to continuously collect data on a particular student. So if you have to make big decisions, that you have that.
Yeah. So is the idea there that going back to trying to find like really naturally occurring ways of collecting data, it sounds like the idea with check in, check out is that information, whether it's called data or not, is collected, like this score that is meant to summarize, the response as part of the tier 2 procedure. But it might not be obvious to then use that information as data to answer other questions or something like that. Like, is that the idea?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because do you ever do folks ever look at it as group data? So average that out and then look at it over time or something like that?
Sure. And the ask of the tier 2 systems team is to look at that data in aggregate and kind of self-evaluate the effectiveness of the intervention. So if only 40%, let's say we have 10 students in check in, check out, and we would have more, but if 4 of the students are responding and 6 are not, the next step is to step back and say, hey, wait a minute, are we doing this with fidelity?
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe this isn't a student issue. Maybe this
Yeah.
is a fidelity of implementation issue. So, and we have trackers we provide schools that they can do that once a month. And so at the end of the year, they can take a look at that intervention and get some a big lens around
Yeah.
how it went. I think that's
Yeah.
what you're asking.
Yeah. I love that, because the answer to like the question, are we doing it? Are we using the procedure with fidelity? That is really hard to answer without data, because we all want to do so well that I think we're slightly, or maybe not slightly, maybe a lot, like prone to saying that we are in overestimating it. That doesn't make us like evil people. It's just kind of a human tendency, to try to lean in areas where we have to apply judgment. We tend to lean towards like what we want to be true. and,
Sure.
and sometimes you just need more information to provide you with an opportunity to adjust that perception if needed. Sometimes you get it right and like you are doing it well, but nice to have a little bit of backup information.
Yeah, and I kind of see it as a stopgap. So if we're starting in August and we wait until December to have a look at how all students are going, there's some time loss where we could have, interrupted what wasn't going well.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about from the staff perspective, not necessarily from student successes with that. Sorry.
Yeah. So
yeah, I think that's a really cool way to use data that are being collected that's simple. And that's an evidence-based practice or intervention.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that folks who are using check in, check out, with the system, the 0, 1, 2, think of that as data that can answer a bunch of questions? Or do they think of it more just like it's a procedure that I'm asked to do?
I think there's probably a mixed.
Yeah.
It's kind of variable. The coordinator of the particular intervention, that person is seeped in the data. I mean, decisions are made for a young person, a student. If the student's responding and doing really well, then what are our next steps to fade the intervention? Or we need to continue it? Or what do we need to do? What enhancements or additional supports need to be added on, layered on top of the check and check out? And I do think I'm always interested in, when I'm talking about check in, check out, the daily progress report serving a multitude of really being so useful.
Yeah.
Right. And having different ways to answer different questions with the same data collection piece. I find sometimes teams are like, oh, like it's a click moment,
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, we're collecting all this, and the decision to fade or increase, we use it that way.
Yeah.
But we hadn't thought about our students with an IEP. Perhaps they're in check and check out, and we take some of their objectives from their IEP, put it on their daily progress report, and that data is being collected, and the case manager doesn't have to spend a week and a half at the end of the quarter talking to every teacher. I mean, yes, that's important. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's much more authentic data that's being collected on a daily basis than having a quarterly review with the teachers. I would think.
Yeah. This is where I think like the natural creative process starts to intersect with data use. Is like you learn to use data in one way. So for example, the check in, check out system, right? And then I think you kind of pointed to this earlier. For some people, it unlocks more ideas because they see like patterns, right? They begin to see not patterns necessarily in the data. That's not really what I mean. But what I mean is patterns in the sense of, oh, I've taken a procedure I was asked to do that happens to generate data. And then I learned that I can use that data to answer questions that are important for my job. And then like the logical sort of leap after that is, I wonder where else in my day that's happening. And I think that I don't know that that happens like for everybody, but I have seen it with other people. We'll be talking with them. They'll have a data question, like a technical question, and we'll be talking through it. And then they'll be like, oh, wait a minute, I could do this with something else too. And that's where I think it can get really creative, just sort of like triggering those moments that help people get past just data as a procedure and cross over to that, like that realm of, oh, it's data as a tool. And then not only that, but like an available tool. Once you stop demanding that it be perfect, then you just start to see it everywhere, like, because we're generating so much of it, everything from like the attendance reports. Or I talked to one teacher who was like, my favorite source of data is homework. Like, as I grade homework, I'm looking through not only like the score of the homework, but the pattern of errors that I see. I had another one to be even less formal about it. I had another one who's like, parent teacher conferences, like my notebook that I take, just kind of looking across conferences to see like, oh, I wonder if there are patterns of things that tend to come up, like, and it's not like they're writing code and doing a sentiment analysis on like the words in the notebook. It's like they're using their professional judgment and these like years and years of experience to allow the patterns to kind of jump off the page. And then like, and then work with that a little bit, like, and see what questions they have. I don't know. I love that because it makes me feel like you're watching an artist in a way, it's like you're watching this thing organically develop, but it sometimes, this is a pet theory of mine, I have no idea if this is true, but I feel like sometimes it's like we gotta give people permission to think that way. Right. And it can get really hard because so much of the way we talk about data is it's this like arbiter of, it's this thing that is supposed to like eliminate uncertainty, right? And that's just not, we live in an uncertain world. There's nothing can do that, not even data, right? And I think it causes people to sort of feel like it never fully captures the complexity of the world, because it's like, well, I don't want to look at the data because it will inevitably not tell the whole story, which is kind of true until you stop expecting it to tell the whole story and you sort of use it as it. Then I feel like that's when people start doing that thing where they're just like, oh, I didn't realize I'm generating data everywhere. Then it's just a habit of like, oh, I shouldn't go just off of my gut. I got a real powerful gut, but also like I should mature that with some other things around it. And yeah, it's really cool when you start to see it happen. I don't know how to make it happen at scale though. Do you like get a lot of people to realize that at once? I don't know.
I know for a while, like in training and conversations, I was trying to not use the word data, but replace it with information.
Yes.
Because like sometimes that term in and of itself can
Loaded.
Shut people down or be a tiny bit intimidating. So I was moving away from data just to talk about what kind of information are you gathering? And
yeah. Did it help?
I don't know. But I think those two words are well put together. I think that is, I think that's one way to think about it.
For sure. Yeah.
And what educator, what professional doesn't want information?
Yeah.
So sure, it's synonymous.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I was looking at our little notes here ahead of this, and you had a really interesting question in here about misinformation and how we think about that. What are your thoughts on that? Or I don't know if you don't want to call it misinformation. I understand in our climate, misinformation probably implies like a bunch of different things, but I think the basic idea was the upside to modern sort of living is we have a lot of information, and then the downside is we have a lot of information, right? And it can be hard to tell what's actually useful and what's not. But what was it? Say more about the context of that. Wondering.
Yeah, I just think that being a good consumer of data, being a good collector of data, making sure the data is being collected with integrity, that it addresses all students or supports all students, and schools. And we shouldn't just keep this at the school level. We think districts, and additionally, fidelity of whatever work we're doing. I think there are certain protocols and programs that certainly don't. I mean, just even curriculum don't come with a fidelity measure.
Yeah.
And And I think that's always, I also think that's a good thing to look for. If you're a decision maker around purchasing curriculum or programs or what have you, I think that would be the first question to ask. Do you have a fidelity measure that's specific to your program or package?
Yeah. What does that look like when it exists? Is it like an observation protocol that someone can like look at the delivery of the curriculum and look for certain details in the implementation? Like, how does
I
it?
mean, the TFI is the fidelity tool we use
Yeah.
for PBIS.
Yeah.
But, even a particular curriculum, maybe it's a checklist asking teachers,
Yeah.
did you cover this goal? Did you, I'm just making this up, but,
Yeah.
collect data to determine mastery? Did you, you know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
not just about student outcome, but it's about reflecting on the adult
Yeah.
delivery of a curriculum or the methodology or what have you.
That's really interesting in the context of a discussion about the quality of information, the quality of data, and there being so much data, and it's kind of hard to tell, what's useful and what's not, because I think we can apply a similar question to all of the available tools that we have out there, like that we could use either for free or buy in some cases, curriculum or there's stuff like that. And we're still, as the consumers, like just like you said, we're kind of left with the task of evaluating, what's going to give us the best probability of returning the results that we want. It's like so many things in education that are abstract. It's an idea we can all agree is good, but then we kind of don't really know in real life, like, okay, but what are the indicators, right? And I think
how do we operationalize that?
Yes, exactly. And I think you brought up like a major one, which is, was there a reasonable attempt to control the use of this so it mirrors the use of it when they designed it, right? Or measured the results, right? And even if it's not perfect, like the TFI or any other sort of protocol is not perfect, but it's a solid attempt at it. If nothing else, it implies that the designers cared enough about the implementation to try and control it. And I think that says something. I've been thinking a lot about, I've been reading this book called The Death of Expertise. Have you heard of this book?
No.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of it in there that is nuanced and complex. I think I found it to be a book where I was not necessarily comfortable with like every single thing that I read, but there was one part that really stuck out to me, which reminds me of what we're talking about, which is the way that we define expertise. I keep on thinking about my two teenage sons. They're constantly, running up to me with their phones with like a TikTok playing saying, "Hey, did you know that this happened?" And I look at it, I'm like, maybe that did. In some cases it actually did, it being some news event or something, or some explanation of a phenomena. But many times I'm like, I don't, it's just something like it's just not passing the plausibility test for me, and so, but yet I never have a way, because then their response, so I will usually say, y'all should be careful about where you get your information. Sound advice, except for like, it doesn't mean anything to them, because they're just like, well, then what do you want me to watch? And then I can't explain. So what I got from like The Death of Expertise, one of the major ideas I really like is this idea of like, well, how can we define what an expert is, right? Again, imperfect definition, but at least there's some definition. And I kind of like what the author says, which is, number one, there's some documented experience that the quote unquote expert has in the area that they claim to be an expert, right? So they worked, 15 years as a chemist, right? The second is that they've got some formal training, like they got a degree in chemistry or something like that, right? And then the third is that they are widely recognized by their peers in that industry as an expert. So it's like this three kind of like prong definition of expertise, which I'll be first to admit is not perfect. I assume there is a way somehow to meet all three of those definitions and not actually be a good expert. I get that. But I kind of like it, because then I can go to my sons and say like, okay, here's what you should look for, right? And I think that's again, we're in the realm of like, it's better than nothing, because before I'm just like, I don't know, just read better stuff. But I don't know, I can imagine as a teenager, your dad telling you that, that's very frustrating, because Because like, what does that mean? Like, I thought I was reading good stuff.
I would challenge the degree one though, the
Yeah.
second one,
Yeah. Same word.
because I think you can be an expert.
Yep.
You don't need a degree for that.
Sure.
I mean,
Yep.
when we talk about something maybe academic or what have you,
Yep.
and this is maybe too out of the box, but I think sometimes when we meet people who are in a trade or don't have a degree, our opinion changes. And
Oh, so
that's
true.
right. That's not
Yeah.
fair. That's not,
It's like its own bias, isn't it?
it is definitely a bias. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if one might revise that part of the definition as simply has formal training, whether or not it's like, recognized by some sort of certificate or something, maybe doesn't matter as much. But like, in a trade, an electrician is like formally trained as an apprentice or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Or what about a parent? Think about that role. And maybe
Yeah.
I'm going too in the weeds, but there's no degree for that.
No.
I know
Yeah.
parents who are,
Have you ever met
really,
anybody? This is good. I'm being kind of like tongue in cheek here, but I am kind of curious. We never hear anybody claim to be like an expert parent, do we?
I know, right?
I just think if anybody said that, we would immediately like raise our eyebrows.
But you know what? I mean, it is kind of a funny analogy. I would say a lot of us as parents check the fidelity of our parenting
Yeah.
a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that kind of something to think about? Like, gosh, did I handle this correctly? Should I have done this?
Yeah.
And not necessarily critically. I know for me, I'm constantly wondering, should I have done this? Should I have said this?
Yeah.
Should I have offered this experience? And that's
Yeah.
kind of the fidelity of parenting, isn't it?
Well, for
Review
sure.
of it.
If nothing else, it's like a good, healthy, like scientific skepticism about whether or not like, my current method of parenting is correct. Like, I mean,
Exactly.
I'm pretty hard on myself as a parent. I think we probably all are, or most of us are, but like, yeah, there's definitely some questions. I wish that there was, this is gonna sound weird. I wish there was like a TFI for parenting though, that I could just sort of like once a month run through the list and just be like, oh yeah, I really need to work on my listening skills.
Yeah, I'm with you.
I wanted to propose, I'm going through our list of topics here, and I wanted to propose this idea of sharing data. Do you want to talk about that? Like about
I think you should talk about that.
Okay, yeah. Or I meant you, like the kind of royal we. Okay, so here's the way I think about this. I used to be a school psychologist, and I know I said that earlier, but like one of the things that one of my jobs as a school psychologist is I would give a bunch of tests basically, and then I would score the tests, and then the tests acted as data that I would then have to analyze to identify if there was some kind of learning disability with a student I was working with, and then make some recommendations about how we can adjust instruction so that we can make the learning experience more positive and successful for that child. So I don't know if psychs think of it this way. I certainly didn't at the time, but it was basically a data analysis. The testing was the data collection, and then the report writing and the synthesis of all that data was the analysis. And then you have to then go to a meeting with the parent and other staff members there, and then you would have to share that information. And the way that I would share that information is I would literally go through every test, saying the score and then saying what it meant. and then I would share my conclusion. And what I noticed pretty early, though I didn't really know how to fix it, was that was really boring for the people who had to listen to me. and people would, I'm not proud of this, but people like literally would fall asleep. Like I actually made people go to sleep with the way I would present this data. And so I would think about this a lot, especially now where data is such a big part of my job and I have to present it. What about that didn't work? How can I do it better? And, one of the ideas I began which started to come up for me as I reflected more and more on this, is that when we do a data analysis, we do it, at least the way I do it, but I think most people who work with data all the time do a very similar thing. They look at a lot of data and they look at all of these data points. In some cases, I'm looking at hundreds and thousands, right? And then I'm trying to look at patterns across all of those data points and then draw themes from it. And it's those themes that then become the conclusion. And then sometimes I will describe it through a story or something like that, right? So it's very big sequence. You have like all the data, then you got the themes, and then you have like the conclusion and then the story. I realize now the problem I had when I was a school psychologist is I would present it the exact same way. I would present all the data, and then I would give them the themes, all of them, maybe there's 3 or 4, and then I would like draw a conclusion. And then if they were lucky, I would also like add a story at the very end. But see, the problem with that is that as human beings who don't necessarily like, data just isn't a fun thing, you're there for the conclusion and the story, right?
Yeah.
So all of that to say, what I realized is if I didn't want people to fall asleep, I would have to reverse the sequence of the presentation of the analysis, and that became the presentation. So what does the reverse look like? Okay, well, I would just start with a story, and it would just be like something simple but fun. Oh, I wanted to tell you like this funny thing that happened when they came and they took this test with me. Like I asked them, this question, and they had this really creative answer. Like, doesn't that sound like something that they would say? Like, and that would be like a story where you can sort of all come around the humanity of this process.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would go right to, just sort of walking backwards in the analysis. Then I would go to the conclusion, and I would say, like, here's where I think the source of the learning problem is. And then we'll talk about that, explain what that means. Maybe it's like the way they process things visually or something. And then walk back one step, which is the patterns in the data. And then I would just say, like, I think this because these particular tests had these particular scores. And then maybe I'll give like one data point or like 2 data point. One probably was enough. Like, let me give you an example of what this means. When I show this sequence of shapes, here's the ones that she picked, right? Just one data point. I've found rarely that people, like the audience, want more than that. Every once in a while, somebody will be like, oh, I'm going to need more data than that. But it's fine, because if I did my analysis right, I'll have tons of data. I'll just pick another data point to share. But the point is, there's no need to share like all of them, because nobody's really there for that. They're there for like the conclusion and the story. And then I feel compelled to give at least a couple of data points for my credibility, to just be like, okay, just so you know, I'm not making it up.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. So like, I've really been encouraging people to do it that way, lead with the story. It's just more human that way.
I was going to say, I think you humanize the whole process by starting with that and kind of sharing with families that you indeed do know something about their child.
That's right.
I think that's humanizing data.
Yeah. Do y'all have a version of that? Do you have like any data sharing or like data story sharing tips that have worked for you over the years?
I don't know about data sharing stories, but back to what you were talking about in IEP meeting, I think as educators, we need to be in touch with the fact that certainly parents want to know if their child's reading at grade level, what have you.
Yeah.
But oftentimes what parents are interested in is not the same information or data that's gathered through, let's say, an IEP process. I mean, parents want to know if their child's eating lunch with somebody. That would be the first question I would ask.
Totally. Yeah.
And then, okay, the reading is important, but I really want to know that my child's happy.
Yes.
And so I don't know that answers your question, but I think understanding the audience can help inform, like you talked about, the tactics for sharing data and making sure that it's being received. Right? We can share all we want, but like you said, if people are sleeping or tuned out, just So how do we connect that data with what our audience needs and wants?
Yeah,
now, that's 2 different things too, right?
Totally.
Needs and wants.
I kind of wonder why I never, as a school psychologist, why I never asked parents more, like outside of the IEP setting, how it felt to them, or like, what it was like to listen to the scores. I think that kind of feedback could be really interesting inspiration to develop like more ways to share this. You know, it's just different. It depends on the audience, right? If you're with other school psychologists, you could probably share, probably be fun to
Yeah.
share it in the way that we normally would. But like, I think it's much harder. I think to your point about like asking about friends, the way I kind of interpret that is like, we can't assume that the weights that we as educational professionals assign to each of these areas is the same as like what a parent thinks they are, right? Like, you know, maybe we are under particular pressure to have, you know, the math scores show promise or something like that. But maybe to a parent, I know for me, like I'm just like exactly as you said, I more want to know that my kids are making friends, you
Mhm.
know, and I just kind of, I know every parent is different, but I just kind of think that the academics will, you know, most teachers want to do really well, all teachers want to do really well. And I just, it will take care of itself. Right. But what I worry about is the harder to pick up on stuff, you know, like
Right.
whether or not, you know, they have friends. And so to me, the math thing, though, what might be on the teacher's mind is that site-wide goal to get math scores up or something like that. To me, like they're on equal footing. If anything, maybe the social part might be a little bit more important to me. But like,
Yeah.
how would the teacher know that? You know, unless I offered that up as information. So I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah.